can start with this conference room with Yorgos. Yorgos, kalispera. Welcome
Kalispera, Nicola.
To school. We are really happy to welcome you and take time to listen to you, to your work and your career, because it's not the first day that you work about the place of the media and the sounds in the constitution of a narrative situation and in the constitution of space. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you in this frame, and I hope you will enjoy the discussion that may take place after your presentation.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Nicola, for the invitation to the workshop and the opportunity to speak about cinematic narration. It's, I'm an architect and direct documentary film and multimedia projects director. I have studied architecture in Greece and cinema, video art, and animation in France. And I have taught in the Department of Architecture in the University of Thessaly together with Nicola Remy. And I'm a member of the Laboratory of Environmental Communication and Audiovisual Documentation, LECAD, of the Department of Architecture, where one of the principal research projects was the creation of a sound database of the city of Volos and of the surrounding area, in a larger project that concerned the production of material for the Museum of the City of Volos. My personal interest on urban soundscape was connected with Elektra Venakis' interest in film soundscape. Elektra Venaki is a sound designer and one of the best film editors in Greece. She's collaborating with our laboratory as she teaches in different universities in Greece. She would not be present this night, and she's writing a PhD work on the sound in the Balkan cinema. She has also written several papers on the cinema of one of the eminent Greek experimental cinematographers, Antoaneta Angelidou. So the subject of this presentation will be the use and interpretation of sound, voice, and soundscape of urban landscape or landscape in cinematic narration. We will deal mostly with how mainstream fiction movies treat sound and what are the recent trends towards what we call cinematic audiovisuality. That means dialogue between sound and image in a whole approach of the cinematic narration. The basic question is how the sound phenomena that we experience in everyday life are interpreted and reproduced in audiovisual productions, cinema, television, video games, multimedia productions, and so on. Mainstream fiction movies, sound is closely connected to the image, and so was the theoretical approach up to the 80s, before a new generation film critics started a new approach to the sound elements in cinematic narration. Of course, parallel to mainstream fiction movies, we had experimental films since the 20s and experimental video and video art in the 70s and 80s, which, in difference to mainstream movies, had a creative and innovative approach to the use of sound. So first, we must state that the sonic experience, it's a cultural experience. It's not only technique, and that we listen and perceive a soundscape differently according to our education, historical and geographical conditions. Since we perceive differently, we create differently soundscape in cinematic production. Here in the extract from Emily Thompson's introduction to the soundscape of modernity, you see that she emphasizes that to hear is a cultural phenomenon, and that the cultural dimensions of sound include scientific and aesthetic methods of listening, the listener's relation with the environment, and the social conditions that determine everyone's hearing of the soundscape. So, landscape has more to do with culture than nature. In mainstream cinema, we have a canonical order of a soundscape. First, image, of course, and then voice, music, and sound. Sound in mainstream cinema until the digital era was limited to sound marks. That means certain specific sounds like a church bell, bird singing, a police car, and so on, that gave the main characteristics of a soundscape. In contemporary audiovisual practice, a digital sound and the multiple soundtracks permit us a new approach with several levels of sound that can constitute a more complex and more rich soundscape. So we have a new perception, a new sound perception that goes towards an immersive audiovisuality, which demands from a viewer or listener not a pathetic perception, but a very active one. I refer to the new bibliography on film sound. You have Rick Altman's and Michel Chion's books. And then you have Kevin Donnelly and the music and sound of experimental film by Holly Roger and Jeremy Barham. Of course, there are more, but these were chosen as some of the more characteristics of the new approach of sonority and soundscape in cinematic narration. We could say that soundscape in fictional cinema are mainly recorded in the field if they are not shot in a cinema studio, and partially constructed in a sound studio during post-production. Of course, in documentary films, the greater part of the soundscape is recorded during the shootings, and a part may be constructed afterwards in post-production, mainly for archive materials. So some images about recording soundscape. Of course, you know, perhaps Lisbon Story by Wim Wenders, where the subject of the film is recording the sound and the image of the city in different media. It's a very interesting film if you're not familiar with that. Speaking of urban landscapes, we have in the time of globalization a trend towards an homogenization of cities, mostly, of course, town centers with commercial centers, all these posters, electronic messages, and so on. The same magazines, the same stores, people having the same habits. And what differs more is soundscape, mainly the voices, and partially the natural soundscape, and sometimes local music. So the soundscape is the element that is more connected to the regional character of an urban landscape. Another crucial problem with seeing a film is when we see a film in a foreign language that we don't know, is whether it is subtitled or revoiced. That means that if it is subtitled, we can hear the original voice and we can enjoy the materiality and the musicality of the dialogues and the characteristic voice of the actors. Whereas in revoicing, it's easier for us to follow the dialogues, but we lose what is the richness of the foreign voice and musicality. Revoicing is chosen by Anglo-Saxon countries because it is supposed to help people that not follow subtitles, like elderly people and people of low cultural status, to follow rich dialogue in a film. Yet, I think that it enforces a nationalistic conviction that everyone speaks like the spectator. For me, when I was in France, I found it very ridicule to see John Wayne enter in a saloon and saying, "Bonjour, Monsieur, Dame." Well, we lost all the musicality of American language and also the dynamic of the character of John Wayne. If we try to classify the sound periods in cinematic history, we have a first period from the beginning of cinema in 1895 up to 1927, where we have the film The Singer of Jazz, which we call it monophonic cinema, because it's not a silent cinema, because it's doubled with music. Then we have the speaking cinema, what was characterized as talkies in the United States until 1977. And afterwards, with the invention of the Dolby system, the multi-track sound system, from 1977 onwards until today, with an intermediate new beginning in 1993 with the digital sound cinema and the digital editing. So, about monophonic cinema, silent film hides the fact that we always have the film accompanied by live music, by one player or a small orchestra, depending on the film theater. And also, sometimes there was a person that was narrating the intertitles for those in the audience that that time could not read the text. So the sound and music was an elementary part of the viewing experience as well as the image was. With speaking cinema, we have the dominant of the voice and music, of course, and the neglection or marginalization of other sounds because we did not have multiple sound channels. I spoke before about the sound marks, the key sounds that were used to create local characteristic soundscape. And of course, we had, ambience captured in location. And in the first period, the soundscape of the film was played on what was called sound on disc, on separate phonograph recordings in synchronization with motion picture. That is like this image that you see, that you have the phonograph coupled with a projector. And of course, an image where we have different kinds of inscription of the sound, analog, digital, and so on, magnetic on the surface of the film, just to have a glimpse. So soundscapes come from field recordings, sound libraries, and construction by Foley artists. And here we have the famous roaring lion of MGM. I don't know if the technicians survived or they changed them a lot. Sound effects have started before cinema in radio era. And here you see in the yearbook, the BBC yearbook of 1931, classification of different effects. Realistic, symbolic, conventional, impressionist, and so on. The thought of technicians that created the sounds together with the actresses that made the dialogues. And here we have a presentation of a classification of sound effects in cinema. It depends if they are the main effects or background effects or designed effects for films that use non-natural sounds like futuristics and science fiction films and so on. You see that the two specific sounds like the wall that is non-recognizable language sounds and background noises called ambience or atmos. Atmos is used in sound databases, so it's useful term to know. And we have sound libraries. In the beginning, they were available in phonographic disc by Anglo-Saxon origin or French origin, because they were the two main cinema industries. We have in Greece sounds from BBC databases and French databases that we find in all films, and they are repeated in modern films as well, because they have historical meaning, and it's an inside jokes. You see the recording of weapons. You have sound technicians that are gathered, and they have all kinds of weapons. They put in line all the kinds of microphones, and they use different ways of shooting in front, parallel, and so on. So they create, they enrich their personal databases. Specific recordings are made for several films. This historical anecdote is a Wilhelm scream, which originated 1951 in a film. It's a scream of a person that was shot, cowboy that was hurt with an arrow flesh, with an arrow, and the scream was used in some films after that, and then it was used in many films, Star Wars, Alien, Toy Story, and so on, as a joke, together with other kinds of scream. So there is a compilation in internet, you can find it, and identify the scream together, other screams. Foliatus is a very interesting and peculiar kind of technician artist who create sounds with very humble elements like potatoes, sand, water, and so on. They recreate realistic ambient sounds, and also they create sound specific for animation films. They use also their voice to create specific sound effects. They have studios, whole studios with a whole bunch of different elements and materials, and cells with thousands and hundreds of objects. There's no very well-known scene from Monty Python, The Holy Grail, is knights riding a fantastic horse. He's going on foot, course, and his servant goes after him, hitting two coconuts together. But in reality, the sound of coconuts banged together did not fit the needs of the scene, and they use real horses to recreate the sound. So there is another historical anecdote about that. Since 1977, we have the Dolby sound system, so we have high quality stereo soundtracks and the possibility to have several soundtracks to use for multi-channel layered sound, also surround sound in the theatrical spaces after the 90s. Sound in experimental cinema and video art is a different exploration of sound possibilities. Sound in experimental cinema and video can be used in very creative ways, provocative, surprising, and so on. You can, I think you can find online the publication. You have, yes, the link here. I will send Nicolas a PDF with all the links so that you can have the so Sion creates a term combining synchronism and synthesis called syncresis about experimental video and films. And we will proceed with some examples in realistic fiction cinema with the brothers Dardenne, the Belgian filmmakers. Hope you are familiar with them. Here you have a presentation of their cinema, the characteristic approach of their cinematic style, close-up shootings, mostly on the back of the characters, and also the use of the sound to characterize the characters, the personalities, the actors of the film. Two examples of their approach is the film Rosetta and 2 Days and 1 Night. In Rosetta, we have a teenager girl that fights her way with her work and her family to get away of both misery. She's angry, she's very active, and the soundscape reflects the violence of her behavior. And you can find in the internet the opening scene of the film. On the other hand, in 2 nights, 2 days and 1 night, you have a woman, a young woman, who is in danger of losing her work unless she persuades her colleagues to vote for her in a majority. And she calls them and tries to get their vote. She is in depression, in fear of losing her work, has almost accepted her defeat, and her voice is low, and so is the soundscape of the film. So two film characters, two different soundscape, two different approaches of the film soundscape. Special case is Jacques Tati, the French director. He's a case, special case himself. He's a history of sound in cinema. He used to work from the 50s with 7 tracks in magnetic tape. So he had a very rich soundscape that he used not in a realistic way, but in different ways to give attention to the spectator to certain elements of the image and on the narration. Here is the two landscape, urban landscape of the film My Angle, Mon Angle. We have a confrontation of the traditional neighborhood, and we have the soundscape of the people speaking, birds singing, the cart with the horse going around, and the newly built new rich family house where all the every life machinery is mechanized, and where we can hear the sounds of every element, every furniture, and even the clothes people are wearing. Both are built, they are not existing buildings, but they are scenery created for the needs of the film. And this is another way of using film. Here is Playtime from 1967. We have an inside scene where the main character, which is played by the director Jacques Tati, which is on the left, is sitting, attending, waiting for to be to have an interview with the director in an office area, and we have a figure coming from far away with characteristic sound of his footsteps coming towards the hero. And here we hear very clearly the footsteps. And afterwards we get a scene that we see the same composition of the interior, but we are outside the building. So we have the glass between us and the actors, and we see the Claire coming towards Tati, but he does not turn his face to look towards the clerk. Normally, if we were inside with him, he would do that because we would be in the same space with him. But since we are outside the building, he hears the footsteps, but do not hear the footsteps, so he does not turn his face. He keeps still, looking in front of him. So this is how he plays with the sound and the interior of the shooting. A special case is for two artists from video art, Bill Viola and Gary Hill. I'll start with Bill Viola, perhaps you know him. I think he's one of the leading artists in the 18th century. He's an artist that has worked with videotapes, video installations, and so on. Especially, I'm referring to a film he did in 1983 called Anthem, where the main, which you can find in the YouTube, and perhaps we could hear just next to it. And what he does is, you see on the left an image of urban soundscapes in USA, and right you have the image of a girl, teenager girl, in the empty space of train station in Los Angeles, and all the soundscape of the anthem is produced by a single piercing scream of the young girl that is restructured and manipulated by Bill Viola to fit to each scene, to each visual environment of each scene. Perhaps I could, sorry.
and spoke properly.
We see the girl still with her mouth shut for most of the film. Only in the end we see that she is the origin of the sound. Do you hear something?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Very hard images because heart operations and so on. Voilà, d'accord. So you get the idea, okay? Viola is very influenced by Eastern religion, Zen spirit, and he supposed in this film and many of his video installations and tapes follows the form of religious stance and Gary Hill is another American artist who has focused on the language and the text, the treatment of human voice and the text. He has collaborated with American poets in the 70s. And he has a site in YouTube where you can see most of his film. And one which is more refer to his research on voice and linguistic is Uraaru. It was filmed in Japan, and the notion of acoustic palindromes, words that can be read both ways, which are located in the Japanese language, and he relates it to the no theater, Japan theater. Sorry.
Να με κι εγώ έφτασα κιόλας, ναι είμαι ο γνωστός μικρός Νικόλας.
I have the title here. Don't let me shut the... Okay. Small incident.
Le petit Nicolas, στα ελληνικά.
Oui, c'est ça. C'était dedicated to Nicolas Remy. And we have another videotape by Gary Hill, which refers to Alice in Wonderland, with the title, Why Do Things Get in a Muddle? The special thing in this videotape is that movements and speech are recorded backwards. So they have a very peculiar sense of sound and movement. Gary Hill says that we can play the tape backwards and we'll be okay. I saw a film, a mainstream film by Nolan lately, Tenet, I don't know if I've seen it, where he manipulates time, and the great part of the film is going back in time. But I'm not sure he has recorded sound backwards. I'd like to see it again and read any critics who say he has imitated the approach of Gary Hill. And finally, we get with the case of Antoinetta Angelidis, is a Greek film director, visual artist, and scholar. She has an architecture and film background and has directed 4 feature films. The first one in France, in black and white, in 1977, and these 3 others in Greece. What the main characteristic of her work is that she elaborates her sound in a non-realistic way, and she gives a very specific importance to the use of the female voice as a sonic device. Her cinema is poetic, very feminist and politic cinema. And she collaborates in each of her films with a different music composer. In Topos, which is her second film from 1985, she collaborated with Georges Apergis, who is a Greek-French composer and theater director, who has worked with the human voice as a musical element, and he has collaborated with Antoinetta in Topos. The story in Topos is a woman who gives birth and dies in the beginning of the film, and then she is multiplied in many different persons, different aspects, with different fragments of her body in different times. And we have one female voice, many women, and occasionally a female voice on the image of a man. I'll try to show you an expert.
Σαν να βρίσκεται αλλού ο νους της. Σ' άλλο κόσμο. Κι όμως είμαι βέβαιη πως τον αγαπάει. Ούτε η ίδια το ξέρει. Αμφιβάλλω αν έσκυψε από το παραθυρό της να τον δει. όμως διαισθάνεται πως είναι εκεί κοντά της.
We don't have any realistic sound. Everything is made by human voice. So I think we came to the end.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much. Thank you. Thank you,
Very much, Yorgo.
Nicola.
A pleasure to go through the times and the techniques and the narrative cinematic and all these examples. We really want to go further in each of it and take time to listen and see together. So maybe we can open the discussion now with
Yes.
you follow this presentation. You know, if you want to raise your hand, take the mic, it's your turn. I agree with you. I just wanted to ask to the audience if they can explain how they get used to see movie in their own language. If the theater plays with revoicing or with subtitle, maybe it could be interesting to learn about how they usually get to the sound of the actors.
Excuse me, yes, perhaps your last remarks makes me think about when I was in Poland and in Russia, former, where all the foreign movies were revoiced by one voice.
Yes.
And it reminds me of one of my first experience of that. It was one of the first erotic movie that we saw. It was called Emmanuel. I don't know if you remember of Emmanuel.
Yes, yes.
1, 2, 3, 4. And it was all revoiced by one male voice. And it was very strange experience as I was a teenager.
Yes. We know that kind of revoicing in Greece because there were imported animated films and all characters were revoiced by the same male voice, and it was very peculiar, yes.
And in the same, it was not so funny, but I remember that a few years ago, where Jules is living, we had some kind of education week about movies and sounds. And I remember that was a very interesting experience because our teacher was playing the same, actually the same video, but he has mounted two different sounds. It was a competition of ski, and you could see two skiers doing the parkour, and the sound was different. And one sound was saying that the skier was not so good. The second sound saying that skier it was the best of the world, but it was and everybody at the end was the professor asked the question, who do you think skied the best? And of course we said what the sound said. Even and actually when we saw the two pictures close to one to the other one on the two TV set, it was very clear, but there was a lot of visual differences. But the sound was doing the new reality actually.
I remember in 70s that there were cinema productions like Italian that the same actors revoiced the film in English. Marcello Mastroianni, Monica Vitti, we heard their voices but speaking English. So they had an international copy and an Italian copy. They kept the soundscape the same and they changed the dialogue version. A new thing that came from an old director that experiments all the time is Godard. That's his last film a few years ago. Normally in mainstream films, now with Dolby and digital sound, you have the dialogues and the main soundscape from the front sound speakers, and you get the secondary information from the loudspeakers in your back. Godard made the opposite. He passed the main information in the back loudspeakers. So he experimented with that. He's preparing a new film. I don't know what he will do this time. Of course, there are directors that explore soundscape, but known in a realistic way, like David Lynch, that has very rich soundscapes, but they are not corresponding to the soundscape of the environment in the image, but they are a parallel sound world.
I have this memory, if I may. This is not so much about voice, but the practice of field recording itself. I haven't seen it much in cinema, but I still bring in mind a moment in the film 24-Hour Party People, which is about the Manchester scene of, the early raves and, so they're trying to reach out to a producer who is half madman or something, obsessed with sound. So they're going to a field to get him, and he's field recording at the time with a blimp and with a dead cat around it and stuff like that. And the whole seeing him like that is part of building his character as being a madman. So I found it was very intriguing, and just wanted to point it out, that this obsession with sound sometimes might be inconceivable even for directors. I'm sure directors have in mind what the sound engineers are doing, but you know what I mean, as part of the narrative. That was a small comment.
In Wim Wenders' film Lisbon Story, the sound engineer is the protagonist of the film. The story is that his friend has gone to Portugal to make a film, to film Porto, the city of Porto, the city of Lisbon, in the way a silent film was filmed. and he asked his friend, the sound engineer, to come and collect sounds to go with the film. And so starts an adventure where the sound engineer goes to Lisbon, does not find his friend. He finds a bunch of children that are filming the city with video cameras. He finds also the group Matradeus, who is practicing in the next apartment, and he also finds the poems of the poet, the Portuguese poet. Look now. So you have a foreigner, a German sound engineer that gets in Portugal and tries to learn the language with a dictionary, and also to discover the sound of the city through film and through video. And he's attracted by the singer Matradeus and so on. So you have a different kinds of sound, different approaches of the image of the city. It's a very interesting film.
Can you repeat the title, because I lost connection for a bit?
Lisbon Story. Lisbon Story.
Cool.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember the first scene of that movie. Him in his car coming from Germany through France to Spain and listening to all the radio stations connection. And then you have translation on the road all through long.
And also he has his dictionary, trying to learn certain words. Yes.
Yes, I remember too. Yes.
Yes.
Yorgos, I was thinking about some slides you show, and I remember, of course, Lisbon Story and Jacques Tati, of course, which is where the sound is in his movie sounds just like another character. That just is so present and is in the composition of the picture and the story, of course. Would you say that the modern Jacques Tati concerning sound will be the brother Dardenne from Belgium, or did you pick up this example because they have similar approach to sound in film?
No, I picked Tati as an example of a director that experiments with film when he pushes technology to the limits. He has an analog recording of sound, but he does not use it in a. He always records very extremely good quality of sound in 7 tracks, and he uses it as music. The musicality of urban sound environment. You can hear sound in the modern house. You can hear inside sounds while you are in the front door in the garden, as if it was close to you. He plays with the distance and the kind of sound. You can hear of the image, a sound, and you think it is something, and then you see on the sound is something else. It is somebody cleaning the glasses, the window sills. He plays always, he pulls the leg of the spectator. He makes comments on the use of the sound. Dardenne is a very good example of realistic cinema, both poetic and realistic, where soundscape characterizes the character, like how music is used by directors to announce the presence of different protagonists. like say Lawrence of Arabia. If you see an analysis of the film, each character has its own musical theme that announces his presence before we even see him. It may be a theme or an organ, a violin or a piano, and so on. Directors often use this style of indicating the characteristics of a role, of a character.
In the Darden film, actually, if I remember, the second one that you pick up with the girl that's fighting for his position at the small company, I remember. I can't remember the soundscape of this film, but I remember the intensity of the voice. And if I remember well, I will say that it will be a translation of this inside the inner soundscape of this woman.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Because she tried, she is in a very difficult situation because she came back from congé from during weeks where she was ill, and when she came, her boss told her she's fired, except if the all 20 other workers of the small industry accept to lose a small part of their salary to save her salary. So she had to convince people, family, to take back the prime that the boss gave it to her. So it's amazing how she fight for that, and it's difficult for her. And of course, because inside of her, she can't feel so comfortable for asking that. And the sound expresses this, and this is the strength of the Darden film, in my opinion. I've never realized that sound is playing such important role in this
yes
specific room.
Soundscape is very low, very limited volume. Whereas in Rosetta, it's very aggressive. When she gets out of the factory in the beginning, in the beginning she cries, and when she gets out in the city, you have a loud soundscape that corresponds to her state of spirit. The city responds to her state of spirit. I don't know if anyone is familiar with video art. Guy Hill and Bill Viola are the main artists of video art, of experimental video, 20th century. And many directors of cinema have got ideas from their films. I remember many years ago when Peter Greenaway came to the Thessaloniki Film Festival, he said that a videotape of Bill Viola is worth more than 10 films, American mainstream films. I don't remember by which director, and all the film critics started asking, who is Bill Viola? And it was very funny. Yes, he said 10 films of Scorsese, which was very insulting for the Greek audience and film critics because they didn't have an idea about video, experimental film and video. Peter Greenaway is also experimenting with voice in his work, yes.
Yorgos, I will ask you a question to Jules in Grenoble. I was just wondering if there's still the 102 Rue d'Alembert. Still, it's an experimental place where experimental cinema were played, and many artists there were playing with the, painting on the film of the pellicule, and also
yes.
the translation of these images in sound. Sound, of course, not very harmonic.
Yes.
But is it still open, Julien?
Well, I presume it's not closed yet, but I've not been there for 1 year, as you can guess. And
Yeah.
effectively, there is some very experimental way of watching movies that they were experimenting there. For example, it was for me the beginning of cinema concert, where the movie was projected and all the music was improvised with all the people there, and with a small team of 3-4 persons that had prepared something, but everything was improvised to make the soundtrack of the project movie. But in the same time, it was also very experimental movie, the kind of movie, a mainstream movie we can talk about here. I mean, there are all people trying to seize this kind of medias, like projecting, like filming, like working on the material way of making movie, and the soundtrack, and the sound in the room, in the place, and also sometimes burning the pellicule, how do you say that, Nicolas? The film itself. And it was very experimental all the time. Yeah, I hope they're going on. That will be going on.
I'm just wondering, Yorgo, sorry, I am speaking a lot. About Angelopoulos. You haven't talked about it. I'm not I don't know so much his Ergo 2, his film, but it shows that it's quite atmospheric film anyway at the end. What's your opinion?
Sorry, what was the last that you said?
I remember seeing a very atmospheric scene where actually the psychology of the character and the difficulty of course through the image, but what about the sound? I'm just wondering, discussed it with you.
I have not studied him from the point of view of soundscape. I have to come back to it, but I think he uses sound recorded in the field and not sound effects, although he also uses sounds coming from sound libraries as sound marks. And he has an approach of a peculiar approach of Greece with cloudy landscapes, no sun, rain, snow, and so on. An environment, a landscape that creates an atmosphere, and heavy for the Greek history and the political environment of the story, but I don't remember details. But I remember that he also uses a seagull, which comes from a BBC sound library used from the 50s, because it's used in many old Greek
cinema films. It's well known. Concerning this issue, I remember when I started to study at Cresson, I started, of course, to listen more sounds, and I found a lot of CDs at this time in the library, at the public library, with sound effect. And it's amazing because we were discussing that with Julien and Jules, and Henri Torg, our colleague, by saying when you read documentation of the CDs and you look on the title of the sound effect, you feel that you will hear something amazing, and you're always disappointed. It's never the sound that you were expecting. Even I don't know what we were expecting, but it was always a shift in between the expectation when you read.
Yes, it's true. I remember searching in BBC database for the sound of sea, and all the sounds were of rather heavy sea, like the waves striking Dover rocks, which is totally different from the Mediterranean soft sound of the sea in the sound. So we could not use that. We had to record our own ambience.
I do agree with Nicolas, with all these old CDs that were full of presumed sound effects. But since I suppose you all know the sound art site, where it's very all together, mixing some, and I was very amazed of all the small sound effects that you can find on it. And I was very curious when I discovered, and I could find a sound of a leaf on a dead leaf on the road. It's like this, you know, very subtle, and there are millions of it. I don't know how many, but there are millions of micro sounds that you can use to build a soundscape for generally it's for composing or for mixing with the movie. But it's amazing all the subtleties that we have gained since these old CDs of sound effects, as Nicolas says.
I would like maybe you, I don't know if you have colleague here that works in radio. Shaska, I saw you that you followed the conference. What do you think about this? I'm asking the question. Sorry about that. About how do you call it? Jack Foley artists. Maybe you use that in your radio program. People that create sounds, scenes, sound objects. What's your opinion? Do you think there is a radio specificity in comparison with cinema?
Well, when I saw the Yorgos photo, it reminded me of a very interesting performance of Paulita Bajs-Grozoduro from Radio Theatre. She was doing the reconstruction of the way how the radio drama was used to be done, and she did kind of a theater performance out of it. At the moment, it basically, I mean, it's more the rarity and exceptional if you do the sound effects live. But we still have the studio, and it's like really amazing when you go there because you have like a stairs when each step is made out of the different material, you know, like a metal, wooden, etc. We still have a bat, you know, when they used to do sound water effects. So it's like I would say probably almost a dream of a radio maker, you know, to make it again the way it used to be done. But no, now we are doing either field recordings, and we kind of record the sound effects, or we use the banks if there is no time to do the recordings for radio drama or acoustic radio work anew. But you know, I was one long time ago. I was thinking a lot about this audio visual dialogue, you know, because I sometimes experiment with watching the movie without the sound. It's like really funny how sometimes basically it falls apart because you see that the sound is like connecting the images and basically convey a completely different narrative. Yeah, and this is like really interesting because in relation to radio drama, when you have no visuals, you know, it's this continuity of sound place in a bit different way sometimes. But again, it depends, you know, if you're going the realistic way or if you work more with the textures and rhythms and composition of sound. Yeah. So it opens, I would say, a lot of. It's interesting, you know, for me as a radio maker to think about the way how the sound is used in movie and then to translate in the medium of sound itself. It's a radio or a sound artwork. Yeah. Well, this is like not very. It's just your thoughts, yeah. But it was very interesting to follow the lecture. So thank you. Yeah.
Actually, it's a question that I will forward to Dana and Yorgo, if you still with us. I realized that with the example that Yorgos chose today to show us, and actually with the two Dardenne movies, maybe we have also some kind of example of expression with sounds about vulnerability. Vulnerability in your work, in your psyche, in your soul. That might also be very, in the sounding point of view, very different from the example of Jean-Paul this morning, for example. And some recording that I did this afternoon too, which was very silent. But I mean, with vulnerability, maybe we thought that it could be, I myself thought that it could be some kind of form of silence because it miss life, it miss things. But in movie and cinematic narration, maybe we can find another example or category of such soundscape, maybe. I don't know.
I don't know as well, Nicola. It's a very nice question. I have been thinking about this all day, to be exact, especially in the workshop when we had all this discussion about how sound can describe vulnerability, and it is something that I'm also thinking. To me, to be honest, I understand vulnerability and sound more in the from the aspect of narratives, you know, from the aspect of expressing it with words or making it audible. So I don't know, maybe by the end of the winter school, we will be able to have such an answer.
Get a couple of examples. One from Walter Murch, actually Coppola, but Walter Murch did the film, in fact. The Conversation, which also involves field recording, and and I think the way the character is structured, especially in his solo scenes, Gene Hackman, with empty spaces and lots of reverb, I think they reveal some sort of a fragile, lonely character because he's constantly in the verge, and in ethical dilemmas. But he's also a very, very lonely man, although his work involves the voices of many, many other people. Another occasion, and that's not where I found out, that's inside the information from the sound designer of Seven. Actually, his colleague Chris Watson was telling us that I don't remember the name of the sound designer of Seven, but you remember all this atmosphere, dystopic atmosphere that was recorded in a totally different. It was not made up. It was not built or composed. It was recorded in real time. Well, large parts of it from under his window, because there was a pub right underneath, and he was living on the top floor, and you had this effect of the sounds from the alley coming up with broken bottles and yells of drunken people. So that also, creates this atmosphere of uncertainty in a way, and dystopia. But that's, just saying.
I found very interesting what you were saying, Yorgos, about the position of the loudspeakers, you know, in the space where the information is placed, be it in front or backwards, you know, and how we are used to the a certain mise-en-scene of sound, and suddenly when it changes, it also, I would say, create a certain uncertainty or vulnerability, if we could say. And I also see with the sound in the, let's say, sound artworks, you know, as soon as you break the convention, be it with the temporality or of the narrative, you know, it immediately creates some kind of an empty space or like a rupture, you know, that can make you more vulnerable. So as soon as the convention is broken, I think, you know, in this experimentation with the sound and the visual, or within the sound work, with the way the narrative is told via sound only, it's like really it opens a space for another way of attention to what we are listening to. You know, as the example of Jean-Paul Thibault today in the morning, you know, when he was talking, when he played this a field recording of absence of human voices, you know, something that it's maybe not as we usually accustomed to. And this is, I'd say, a certain insecurity, you know, when you're put in the when you're confronted with an artwork or a clips like that.
I don't know if I can say something.
Of course you can. Please.
Actually, because thank you, of course, for your presentation, but because we mentioned the notion of vulnerability, I was all the time having this question in my head about sound and vulnerable space. And I asked you, Nicolas, at the beginning of the seminar about what is the aspect of sound of vulnerability. Then I kept asking myself the question. And then I was thinking about two things. I was thinking, and after also I saw the presentation, that we have two ways of thinking vulnerability. There is a vulnerable space and there is a vulnerable moment. Like, as I mentioned, and I was walking in the street of Beirut after the explosion, it is a vulnerable space, but while walking after 4 months, it has not the same vulnerable aspect as we were walking after 1 month, because my sister went after 1 week and she was like stepping the glass on the floor. We were smelling the smoke. After 4 months, and I went with my students, I was really afraid that we will not be able to taking pictures or to register sounds. And then I realized like it is not really a vulnerable space as I expect. So it's really a moment. And like even in the presentation today, there is like in cinema where the sound wants to express a moment of vulnerability sometimes. In the space, it might be different. So this is one of, but it's like really, it's to think about it's a space or it's a moment. And I think we need to think, what do we mean by vulnerable? Is it vulnerable, it means a space after a war, or it's a vulnerable, a normal space, let's say, but it's because there is no light, or because it's silent, it became vulnerable. So it's like really to have definition to what vulnerable means. We will understand the sound differently.
Of course, thank you very much for your income. It's a great remark you say, and I agree, and totally agree with you. Totally agree with you. And as I said it in the first day, we cannot compare form of vulnerability, of course, and we might be open of this richness of the possibility to be vulnerable. Okay, of course, of course. When you live a catastrophe like you experimented, of course, the vulnerability will be much more intense that we might experiment it in another city, whatever. I think the question that we try to figure out with you, because actually this is not a classic education week. We don't have any lesson to give. We just try to gather you, which are, and just to think about it. It's such common to gather your opinion and these different forms of vulnerability. This has been said at the beginning of the week by Theo and Sebastian by saying that it's a form of the vulnerability of the space, vulnerability of the environment, vulnerability of the social relation. Maybe there is a fourth category, which, of course, and the question of time is of course very, very important. Of course. Thank you for your comments.
You're welcome.
Actually, I really think it's what I said when I had a similar question the first day, that somehow maybe the arts, the cinema, the radio can help us on this issue, because sometimes it's not the job of a scientific or of a researcher at Cresson or wherever you are to do that, because it's impossible it's too soon to describe with words, with analysis, with soundtracks. Maybe it could be something more, we have to wait a little bit and to do the scientific work, let's say, and just have a more artistic approach. I don't know.
I was wondering, hello, to Angelia Paxinou, I'm with Nicola. And I was wondering actually on this point, which way vulnerability can also be something like ambience, actually also something really objective, but it can be subjective also. I mean, there are big moments of vulnerable moments and vulnerable spaces, and as you described, but each one, because actually vulnerability is weaknesses also that we sense in ordinary life, in long term. So these weaknesses hide something subjective in it. So I think it's interesting to find this climacus, this scale of vulnerabilities from a really big one to small individual vulnerabilities. I mean, and objectives to more subjective. I mean, people with special needs are more objectives. I don't know how to explain it, if you understand what I mean, vulnerabilities, but then each one in a space can have his own sense of vulnerabilities. Moments like a silence for someone can be scary, for other people could be reposing. So I think it's nice to capture moments like that also, more subjective moments.
I think during the epidemic, we have special cases of vulnerability, like going outside and wanting to get near people, touch them, speak to them. At the same time, we have the fear of getting ill. And also during the financial crisis, I remember in 2015, when we had the great crisis, that all people were desperate, that the country was starting to, the financial situation was starting to catastrophic breakdown. At the same time, people went out in tavernas and seaside to see people speak, laugh, and so on. This double situation of danger and okay, we'll go through that together with people. That was the opposite of
typical Lebanese.
I imagine. Close.
Okay. don't have any more comment, we might close for a little our microphone and our camera. And I wish a good night. Thank you again, Yorgos, for your presentation. And
thank you, Nicola. Thank you all.
But I think what we perceive is part of our identity, and our identity is fluid, which means maybe one day I'll perceive the same thing very differently, I guess.